Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Python and JavaScript to create a single page iPhone calculator. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is just create a new virtual environment for our folder. So I've created a brand new folder and put that into my Visual Studio Code. So it's just called Calc App. So now if we head over to our terminal, what I'm going to do is just use Python 3-m and we're going to create a new virtual environment. So it'll be virtual environment myenv. Once that's created, we will then use source and we'll say myenv bin and we'll activate it. So now you can see we have our virtual environment activated. Now all we need to do is just install Flask. So pip3 install Flask. Now, whilst that's happening, we'll come back over here and we're going to create two folders. So we'll have templates and that will hold our HTML files, and then we will have static and that will hold our CSS files. So inside the static, we'll say styles.css, and then inside the templates, we'll say index.html. And then in the root of the folder, so in the Calc app, we will say app.py, and this will hold all of the logic that we are going to use for our application. So first what we'll do is just double check that the terminal's finished, which it has. So now if we do Python 3 app.py, we won't have anything load, but if we then import Flask, so from Flask, import Flask, we're also going to need render template, because that will render the HTML file. We're going to need request as well, because we will be taking in some input, and then JSONify, because we'll be passing the data back to the JavaScript that will be in the index.html file, and that will need to be in JSON format. So now if we do app equal Flask, and then here we'll just say name, and then at the bottom we'll do if name, then we will say main. So if name is double equal to main, then we will do app.run, and we'll pass in debug true just in case we come into any errors. So now we have our app.py set up. What we should probably do is just make sure that everything's working correctly. So we'll create a root, and this will just be a / for the local host. So it'll be the first thing that you come to when you open the 127.0.0.1 500 link. So we'll say def index, and then we're just going to return render template, and this will be index.html. So that will return the render of this file, which currently has nothing in. So if we just put test, and then come back over to our terminal and then Python 3 app.py, we now have this URL which we can copy and then put into here, and we now have test outputting. So everything seems to be working correctly, which is perfect. Now if we come back to we'll go onto our index.html file and we'll just create a HTML5 boilerplate, and in the title we will say iPhone calculator, and this is going to replicate the design of the iPhone calculator. We also need to make sure that we have a link to our script tag. So in here we're going to use Ginger syntaxing, and we'll say URL for, make sure that it's static, and then we'll pass the file name, which will be styles.css. And then we're also going to need a script tag with a source, and here we're going to pass in a CDN for jQuery. So we'll say https code.jquery.com /jQuery 3.6.0, and we'll get the minified version. So now we should have jQuery loaded in and everything working correctly. So what we'll do just to make sure is we'll pass in a script tag, and then we'll say console.log, and we will pass in window. And we'll just make sure that things are working as expected. Now if we refresh, test is gone. If we inspect, perfect, we have a jQuery object. Now if we come back onto our Visual Studio Code, we can remove this console log. And we're just going to create a rough idea for the calculator. So if we have a div with a class of calculator, and then inside of that we'll have a display, and this display is going to have an input field which will be text with an ID of display, but we are going to make sure that it's disabled. So that means that you can't actually physically type in the input field, but it will be there and act as an input field. Now here we want to have a buttons container, so we are going to just create a div with a class of buttons that has an ID of buttons container, and then in here we are just going to dynamically create them. So this will be done using JavaScript. So now down here, what we'll do is we will just have an event listener. So document.add event listener. We'll say DOM content loaded. We'll just pass in a function. And then inside of this, we'll have a constant, which will be the container. And we're going to just get the buttons container. And then we're going to create another constant, and this will be labels. So now here we're going to create an array of labels, and this will be an array that consists of multiple different strings. So this will be the layout of the actual buttons. So first we will have C, because that appears in the top left. We then have plus slash minus, which turns the number into positive or negative. We then have %, and then to finish the top row, we actually have a divide button. Now the divide button you can't actually get using the usual keyboard, so we have to use a Unicode symbol, so U00 capital F7. And then we will start listing the numbers. So we've got 7, 8, 9, and then the times button. And then we've got 4, 5, 6, and the minus button. And then 1, 2, 3, and the plus button. And then 0. We then have the full stop and the equal sign. So that is all that we have for the actual layout of the buttons. So now we need to create some actions. So we'll say constant actions, and we'll make that equal to a JSON object. So first we will have C, and then so the key of C, and we'll assign that to clear display, which will be a function. We are then going to use the Unicode symbol up here, so U00 capital F7, and that will be assigned to append to display inside of a string so that it doesn't actually get called. But we need to make sure that it is double quotes on the outside because we have single quotes in the middle that is breaking the string. So now we have the times button, which will also append to display. We then have the minus button, append to display. And then if I just copy that and one more, and then we make this plus, and we make this equals. The final one will be calculate result. So when these buttons are clicked, they will all do different things. Obviously, that will clear the display. These four will append the results to display, and the equal sign will calculate the results. So now we are going to loop through all of these labels, and we are going to create the buttons dynamically. So if we say labels dot for each, and we will use a throwaway variable of label, and then the arrow function. Here we will say constant button is equal to document.createElement, and we will use button. And then we'll say button.className is equal to button, and button.innerText is equal to label. Button.innerText is equal to label outside of a string. So it's actually using the label that we are referencing as we are looping through. So for instance, on the first loop through, the inner text will be the C button. On the fourth loop through, it will be this Unicode symbol. So next we want to use an if statement to display, to give the correct methods from the actions to the button that is corresponding to. So we'll say if actions, and then label, so if actions at the index of label, so if actions label C, then we are going to output the clear display. So first we will do a button.set attribute, and this is just going to give the onClick function, and then actions label. So on this, if it's got an action with the label, so the first loop through, the action does have the label, so C would match C, then we are going to create an onClick attribute, which will be passed in this. So the onClick attribute will have clear display. And then we are also going to say if the label does not equal to C, then we are going to add a class list or a class to the button. So button.classList.add, and we'll say operator. So now else, if the actions label is double equal to the C button, then we are going to if the actions label is double equal to 0, then we are going to add the class list, and this will say 0, just so that we can style these buttons a little bit more individually. And then we are also going to say set attribute, and this will say onClick, and then append to display 0. And we need to handle that differently, which is why it hasn't been created as an action here. Otherwise, we need to check that the label is not equal to the plus or minus, and that the label is not equal to the % sign. And then if that's all good, we'll set the attribute of onClick, and we will pass in append to display, and here we will just say label. We need to turn these into backticks though, so that we can actually pass in the variable correctly without it throwing any errors. And then outside of this if statement, we will just say container.append child and then pass in the button. So this will add the button to the buttons container, which we have listed up here. Okay, so now outside of all of these, we need to start creating some functions that will be used on the clicks. So we'll say function append to display, and now this is what we have been using here, here, and higher up. So we'll say document.get element by ID. We'll say display, and then we'll say the value of the display, and we will plus the value. Now we will create a function to clear the display, and here we will say document.get element by ID and display, and then we'll set the value equal to an empty string. And then finally we need to calculate the results. So we'll say function calculate result, and here we will say const expression is equal to document.get element by ID and the display value. And then we are going to use a post request using JavaScript, or sorry, jQuery. So we'll say $.post and we'll pass in the calculate root. And then we will also pass in a JSON variable for the expression. So we'll say the key expression is equal to this variable expression. And then we are going to say function, and we'll pass in data. So if that is all good and successful, we will then use document.get element by ID display, and we will say the value is equal to the data.result. Okay, so now we have our calculate result button sorted. If we come back to the app.py, you'll know that we don't have a root for it. So here what we need to do is say app.root, and we will pass in calculate. So this root will be assigned or ran when the calculate button is used. And we need to also pass in post. And then here we'll just say define calculate. And we're just going to try, and we'll say expression is equal to request.form, and in square brackets we'll pass in expression. And then here we are going to create a new variable called result and set it to eval of expression, which will essentially evaluate the expression and make sure that it is something that is valid, that it can actually be used. And here we are just going to return the JSON version of this result. And then we're also going to use exception as E, and we will just say return JSONify result. We use an F string to just say error, and then we'll pass in the E here to the error so that we can actually get an error message show up. Okay, so now if we come back to Google Chrome and we so I missed out a comma between calculate and methods. So need to run it again, and if I refresh, we now have a HTML file that has our buttons, which hasn't dynamically created them. Container.append child is not a function. Is that because it was jQuery rather than, I think I might have mixed the jQuery and the JavaScript together. Yes, I did. Okay, so we need to change that to document.get element by ID and pass in the buttons container. So now if we refresh, we have a calculator that has kind of worked. So if we come back to our our code and we go on to the styles.css, we can start giving the calculator some styling. So we'll say we'll say body, and we'll give that display of flex. We'll justify the content to the center, and we will align the items to the center. That will just centralize everything. We'll give a height of 100 VH, which will make it 100 of the viewport height. So whatever we are seeing here, this will be this viewport height here. It will fit 100% of that. Now, if we say the background color, we will just create a different color. So F0, 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 slightly off-white. And we'll just say the font family Arial and sans serif. So now if we come back to here and we refresh, we have everything centralized with a different background color and some different font. Now we will use the calculator class that we gave to the actual container. So that is this one here. So we'll just double check that everything's spelled correctly. And here we're going to say width of 320 pixels. We'll say background color of 333, which is a darker grey. We'll give a border radius of 10 pixels, which will round the edges, and a box shadow of 0, 0, 20 pixels, and then RGBA, which will be 0, 0, 0, and then 0.2. So that will be a black color that has a lower opacity. So now if we come back here and refresh, you can see that it does start to take the color. Now we will also need to add overflow hidden. And that doesn't actually do anything for the moment, but it will do when we start adding some more color, CSS. So here we'll say display, and we'll say background color 444, and we'll say color of white, and then font size 2M, text align right, and that will obviously put all the text to the right hand side, and then padding of 20 pixels all around. Now we can actually start styling the input. So display input, say width 100%, border none, background none, color white, and font size of 1.5 M. So now if we come back to here and we refresh, you can see that we have a bit more styling. Now just to make sure that things are coming through correctly, which they are not. Value is not defined. Append to display. Did I miss adding the yes? So if I come back to here and then I think I did append to display, so we need to pass in the actual value here. So now if I refresh, okay, so we have that taking up, but the color, the font isn't to the right, which is strange. So if we add text align to the right on the input, we should now see all the font on the right hand side. Perfect. Okay, so now after we've styled the input, we're going to style the buttons. So since we have a container around all of the buttons, we can give it a display of grid. And here we're just going to use grid template columns, and we'll set this equal to 4, or a repeat of 4, 1FR. So now if we come back and refresh, we have it laid out as four columns, which is perfect. Now we can start styling each button individually. And since each button naturally looks the same, other than if it's a 0 or an operator, then we can give it the same styling. So border 1 pixel solid 555, and then background color of 666. So these are just darker greys, but it will actually look like the correct color on the iPhone app. Say color white, font size of 1.5 em, and we'll say padding of 20 pixels. We'll align the text to the center and give a cursor pointer so that when you hover over it, it looks like it's a button that can be clicked. And we're also going to give it a little transition of background color and 0.2 seconds. So every time you hover over the background color, or every time you hover over the button, the background color will take 0.2 seconds to properly blend in. So now we need to add a hover to it to make the transition actually work. So button hover, we'll say background color, and we'll pass in 777. So this will just make it a little bit darker. If we come back to here and we refresh, it's starting to actually look correct, and everything takes a little bit of a lighter color when you hover over them, which is perfect. Now if we say operator, so these are all of these buttons here. We want to make them all a different color, more of like a yellowy orange color. So we'll say background color, and we will make that F0A 500. If I save it, you can see this is a much more orangey yellow color. We'll make sure that the color of the text is white, and we are also going to give it a hover state. And this background color will be D48A00. It's ever so slightly different. So now if I refresh, you can see that it does actually look much more like the iPhone app. But what we need to do now is just make sure that this 0 takes up 2 columns. So if we come back to here, and then we'll say .0, and we'll say grid column, and we'll just span 2. So now grid column span 2. Why is that? So it doesn't have a class of 0. Else if actions of label is triple equal to 0, potentially. Otherwise I'm not 100% sure why. Else if actions of label is triple equal to 0. Ah, it's not actions, that's why. It is just the label, because we are just checking through these labels. We're not checking this anymore. The action stuff was set up here. The action stuff was all set there so that we could add the operator and the actions to the specific one. Whereas now we are just referencing the current label that we are on, and we're checking to see if it's 0. And if it is, it adds a class of 0, which gives the col span of 2. So now we have a styled calculator. Let's just make sure that it functions. So 4 times by 5. 4 times by 5. Why is that coming out like a divide? Ah, right. So what we need to do here is the first one will be divide, because that's obviously divide. So the big bug, everything would have been division. So now that we're multiplying, that needs to be a multiplication. And then because we're minusing, that also needs to be a minus sign. And because we are plussing, that needs to be a plus sign. So now if we come back to here and refresh, we should have a perfectly working calculator. So 4 times by 5, is equal to 20 divided by 6, 3.33333 recurring. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use Python and JavaScript to interact together on the same project, allowing us to manipulate data and create more streamlined applications for better user experience. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thanks, and see you soon.